Здравствуйте, дорогие зрители! Меня зовут Юлия Петрачук, и я являюсь арт-директором некоммерческой музыкальной организации Lyrica Classic Entertainment, которая открывает миру новую и неизвестную музыку, вынося ее на престижные сцены мира и создавая проекты с участием артистов международного уровня. В этом музыкальном сезоне наш фестиваль под названием «Распространяя новую музыку по миру» пройдет в России и представит российской аудитории уникальную возможность познакомиться с современной духовной музыкой американских композиторов в серии концертов в исполнении ведущих музыкантов России и Америки. Этот проект посвящается 150-летию со дня рождения великого русско-американского композитора Сергея Рахманинова. И мы хотим выразить большую благодарность американскому посольству в России за поддержку этого культурно-музыкального проекта и возможности сотрудничества и обмена опыта между американскими и российскими музыкантами. И наш фестиваль откроется уже 30 ноября в Соборной палате, где прозвучит мировая премьера божественной литургии святого Иоанна Златоуста, американского православного композитора Курта Сандера в исполнении вокально-хорового ансамбля «Canticum Festum» под руководством Любови Шенгиной. И сегодня у меня в гостях композитор этого произведения, чьи композиции исполнялись в 14 странах на 5 разных континентах. Большая часть его хоровых и инструментальных произведений черпает вдохновение из возвышенных измерений восточной православной веры и ее богатых художественных традиций. Полную информацию о композиторе вы можете найти под видео. Hello, maestro.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being my guest today and for your contribution to our festival with your beautiful music.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be a part of this.
Yeah, of course. We are really honored. And in our festival in Russia, your substantial choral work, Divine Liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom, will be world premiered by vocal ensemble Canticum Festum, and it will be in the Russian Slavonic language. Please give us more details on the history of the composition. Where did you take inspirations and how did it happen that you started to work with the Russian vocal ensemble Canticum Festum and even made a recording of the liturgy last year, right, during the COVID?
Yes, yes. Well, the history of the liturgy goes back to 2016. In America, we have an organization that supports music, Russian choral music in the United States and various places. And they had commissioned me to compose a liturgy in the English language in the style of Russian choral music, Russian Orthodox choral music. So it had never been done before in the English language to compose a complete liturgy. What we have in America are many smaller parishes of Russian Orthodox parishes and not many composers. So we have certain parts of the liturgy that have been composed in English, but not the full liturgy. So I composed the liturgy. It took me about a year to write the whole liturgy. And it was recorded by the Patriarch Tikhon organization with Peter Yermahov conducting. And the CD was very successful, and it was nominated for a Grammy in 2020 for Best Choral Album. So the reason that I composed the Church Slavonic version, the Russian version, was because we had a concert. Maestro Yermahov and myself, we went to Moscow to have a choral concert, and one of the singers was Lyuba, who is conducting the Canticum Festum, and she really loved the liturgy and wanted to know more about it. And at that time, I had only done some of the movements in the Russian. And so she convinced me to do the rest because she wanted to do a CD recording, which we did right before the COVID, during the COVID situation. So trying to find time to record and to make that work was not easy, but they were able to finish the CD, and the next step is to bring it to the world and to bring it to the live music concert hall.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I hope it will happen very soon. I mean, the CD release. Well, congratulations on your achievements.
Thank you.
And how did you meet Luba and her ensemble?
I met her when I came over to Moscow for the concert.
Okay.
She was one of the singers, and our conductor was not feeling well. Was coming down with a cold, and Luba came over with some medicines to help. And she is also a very fine composer, and so she knew I was here, and so she shared some of her music with me and some of her thoughts on my music, and we just really connected artistically. We understood each other's music very well. And one of the things I can say about her is that she's a very fine conductor who I don't have to explain the music to her. She just seems to understand it instinctively.
Yeah, nice. Well, it's always important when there is a connection between
Yes.
composer and performer, yeah, interpreter of your music. But this will be your first composition in Russian Slavonic language, right?
The first complete liturgy. I've written in Slavonic before, and I've had performances of choral music both here and in Russia. But this is the first time this liturgy has been performed. And I have to say, I composed it for English. And normally I'm used to taking Russian choral music and setting it in English. But here I had to do the opposite. I did English to Slavonic. And I have to admit, when I heard the choir for the first time singing the liturgy in Slavonic, it really changed the sound in a good way. It made it a richer sound, in the Slavonic language has much more beauty to my ears in many ways.
Okay.
So it did take on a different kind of feel than the English version.
Yeah, so there is a difference, yeah, when
Yes.
when it's
And I think there's also a difference in the style of singing. In English, we tend to sing with a more straighter, a brighter sound. And then the Russian sound is a little warmer, a little darker sound, which I really think lends itself well to the composition.
Okay, so you think there is a really big difference in the technique of how, like in the States, singers perform like sacred music, and in Russia, or liturgical music?
Yes, there's a difference, and I think it has to do with our training. I think the Americans have a different way of approaching the voice, and I think it's suited for the English language, which is very difficult to sing. But the Slavonic or the Russian, the training is more of an Italian style, so it's a richer sound, and I think that's what Luba was able to bring out of my music that I really appreciated, is that a more traditional Russian choral sound, which of course that's the sound I really kind of have spent the last 30 years involved with. And so I was really happy to hear how the singers were able to interpret, and they seemed to understand my music very well, which was very rewarding.
So do you have any expectations particular in expressing your music by a vocalist or the choir? We talked about that. There is a big difference between American and Russian schools. So do you prefer, or do you follow the traditions of Orthodox singing, or you give completely freedom to your performers to express your music as they feel it?
That's a good question. I think there's a certain amount of freedom that we all have different voices, even if we're all Russians or we're all Americans. We all have different voices, and it's the uniting of these voices together that creates the choral sound. But I think there are traditions that certainly the Russian choral tradition is a very rich tradition, with Rachmaninoff and Chesnakov and Kostalsky, and going all the way back Arkhangelsky, and and all the way back in history. So there's a long tradition of choral singing. Some of the best choral singing in the world comes out of Russia. And I think they have a way of, I think a lot of it has to do with the color of the sound, of the choral sound, which personally I prefer a darker sound of the Russian
Mhm.
choirs. But in America, we have a number of different styles of singing. Sometimes we take it from a more British, English kind of sound, which is a more straight tone. And I guess there is an American sound as well, which is kind of an in between of the straight singing and the more singing with vibrato and resonance.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think in singing English, I think the American style of singing fits the English better, and
Mhm.
singing in the Slavonic, the Russian style of singing, is better because those words, the language is very important, and the
Mhm.
language has its own musicality. So and the language of Church Slavonic is full of very pure vowels, and in some sense, it sings like Italian because the vowels are very pure.
Mhm.
So I think yeah, I couldn't imagine the Slavonic version being sung in any other way than
Mhm.
with a Russian choir.
Mhm. But you don't have like particular instructions for your performers to perform your music. I'm asking that because it's very interesting, especially like in classical music. There
Mhm.
are experts of the composers, and they say like you have to perform it exactly this way and no right or left step.
Right.
This and basically it's very interesting to collaborate with a living composer and to know opinion of you.
Well, that's the beauty of living composers is that the tradition of my music has not been established. And why we say certain pieces should be performed in a certain way from the past is because of how the performers have consistently performed. But my music is so new that it's very flexible, and I don't know that there is this exact way to perform it.
So
Part of the beauty in the composer-performer relationship is it is a relationship. It's not just a composer saying this is the way it should be done. It's a composer working with a conductor and working with the singers. And
okay,
that's the beauty of new music.
you find your basically style, yeah, in the process
Yes,
and not
precisely.
before when or whatever when you're writing the music. Okay, well, that's interesting because there are two opinions. Yeah, so what
Hmm.
followed
Right.
the course, and the other opinion, exactly as you say. So basically, to refer to the performers of that time, yeah, who worked
Hmm.
with the composer and how they did it.
Right.
Yeah, for
Correct.
example, yeah, Puccini's singers, they did a lot of portamentos. Yeah, at
Hmm.
the same time, experts of Puccini says, no, don't do portamentos because,
Uh,
yeah, because composer didn't write it down on the score. Uh,
right.
yeah, and so,
But but Handel, when he wrote the Messiah, he wrote it for a very small group. And today we have performances of Handel's Messiah with many, many people.
exactly.
And it works. I mean, it's maybe not exactly the way Handel wanted it, but Bach didn't write for the piano either. He wrote for harpsichord or for the so time moves on, and we adjust based on the time we're living in. So I think uh, I would hope that if my music survives, that in the future they will kind of discover their own things about my music. I mean, certainly I have opinions, and I put those in the music of how fast it should be, whether it should be loud or soft, and what the mood is. But there are many things that you can't write out that you have to feel in your heart when you conduct, which is the beauty of music is that you can have many interpretations of one composition.
Yeah, of course. So that's why it's very important to have those kind of collaborations that we're doing right now. So, what was the beginning of your interest in liturgical music?
Well, I grew up as a child. I grew up, in a time when uh, I didn't know much about Russian culture and Russian people. It was in the 1980s, but I knew about Russian music. My father loved Russian classical music. So he played, Glinka, Borodin, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff,
Mhm.
and I grew up hearing this music, and it was to me very natural to move in that direction because I loved Russian classical music from a very young age. And then in the 1990s, I had converted to the Russian Orthodox Church in Cleveland, Ohio, and began to sing in the choir there. And I had been a professional singer in various churches up until that point, but I felt like when I went into the Russian church that the music spoke to me. And being a composer at that time, I felt like uh, I could use a lot of my composition technique to bring this music into the English speaking Orthodox churches. We have in America many Russian churches with uh, English speaking
Mhm.
people. So
Mhm.
I was able to compose Russian style music in the English language for these churches. And it's where I feel most at home is writing this in this style.
Mhm. So basically, composing in this style, is it more like a religious aspect for you, or just a style of of music where you basically find yourself successful in writing?
Yes, it's very much a religious, comes from a religious
Mhm.
center.
Okay.
But of course, I have many different musical styles that I listen to that are not religious that seem to be there in the music as well. Many people say that my music sounds both Russian and American together, and that's a product of what I listen to. Whether it's Aaron Copland or Sergei Rachmaninoff, these are all kind of my experiences. But one of the things I would hope is that when someone listens to my liturgy in Slavonic, they understand that I am not copying a style. I am not copying a style of Russian Orthodox music. I live this music. I'm a conductor myself in a Russian Orthodox church, so it is my music. I'm not stealing some music style from another. I'm not doing that.
Mhm.
So I hope that people will hear that it's my music as much as it is theirs.
Okay, well, of course, I'm sure they will. Your choral works have been sang by some of the finest choirs of Orthodox choral music, including Capella Romana, the Saint Romanus Capella, Conquering Time Ensemble, Archangel Voices, and the Patriarch Tikhon Choir. So, how does it feel to be performed by such high-level musicians? And how was it to work with them?
It's wonderful because it's a rare opportunity. Uh, Choirs in America, we have many good choirs, but uh, it's not always easy to get them to perform new music because they're so used to performing Mozart and Verdi and Puccini and Schubert. So when you get a chance to have your music performed by a choir of that level, that professional level, uh, it's very, very rewarding, and it kind of confirms what you wanted to do, what you wanted the piece to sound like. When you're composing, you have an idea of what it will sound like, but you're never 100% sure until you hear it.
Yeah.
And hearing it by a professional ensemble really it helps to confirm what you were composing, and it also gives you ideas for the next piece.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I do appreciate performances by non-professional choirs too. Some of my favorite performances are by amateurs who just sang with the heart. They sang from their heart, and you can hear that as well.
Hmm.
So, uh, in some sense, I almost prefer that people sing from their heart rather than sing because they're in a professional choir,
Right.
even if it's not quite as precise.
better if it has both. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I know also that you're a researcher. Yeah.
Hmm.
And your work explores the relationships between Orthodox iconography, right? And
Yes.
iconography and music, and how theology and sacred traditions inform the creative process. So could you please share with us what did you find in your research, and what was there maybe something unusual that you would not expect to find?
Yes. Well, in contemporary music and music in the 21st century, there is no rule book for how do you compose. So every composer needs to come up with a process for composing new music.
Mhm.
And being interested in Orthodox music and Orthodox art, I looked to how an iconographer goes about creating art. And in iconography, there is a tradition uh, dating back hundreds of years about how you begin and what kinds of things you include in the icon and what things are symbolic in the icon and what it stands for. And I thought, well, in music, we can do the same thing. We can use imagery to create certain relationships in music. For example, I took an icon of the Transfiguration, and I was able to create certain formal structures in my music. It was for a small chamber instrumental ensemble. And as I was able to use aspects of the icon to create these formal structures, and as a result, it helped guided my creative process. And in some sense, it felt like it was justified the choices that I made. Um, but I think we can learn a lot from the iconography of the church and how there's a process involved. I think one of the problems of 20th century classical music is that we feel maybe we have too much freedom, too much, we could do anything we want.
Mhm.
And that's wonderful, but when you have too much freedom, it's a paradox. You almost feel like you can't do anything
That's
because you can't make choices. You have too many choices. So I
yeah.
think in iconographers, you limit those choices, but you can express your creativity within those choices that you have, within the patterns that have been designed by iconographers.
I see. I see.
So
Wow,
it gets
fascinating.
complicated, but that's kind of a very simple explanation.
Yeah, yeah. Human nature. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So what are your next plans, projects that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, one of the things I'm hoping to do is to do a Russian in the style of the Russian panichida. Requiem is the best translation of kind of a memorial service.
Mhm.
And I've started composing that, and it felt like it was the right time for me to write this. You know, my father passed away last year, and just the circumstances of life in the world, I felt like this was an important project to memorialize those of us who are no longer here on Earth. So that's a project I'm working on. I'm also working on some music for use in parishes throughout the English-speaking world, choral music for the Russian churches here that choirs can sing. And our choirs here in America are very small sometimes, and maybe three, four voices.
Mhm.
So they can't do big pieces like, Chesnikov, Rachmaninoff, Sviridov. They have to do very simple things. But simple doesn't have to be uh, uh, it can still be artistic. So I'm hoping to compose some volumes for these small parish choirs. So it's
Mhm.
a big project and a little project.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Do you always consider that, like before starting a new piece, that who will perform it and will it be even it possible to make performed? Because we know it's difficult to find even just funds to perform your music.
Well, it's easier to do that. but it's not always practical. In other words, this requiem or panihida that I'm writing right now, I don't know who will perform it. I have some conductors who are interested, but it's very there are many things that have to take place in order to make a performance or recording, and it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of people. So my sense is that I compose it, and someday, God willing, people will perform it.
Well, that's important that you don't drop off this idea just because you don't know if it's possible to perform. Well, thank you so much. It was very interesting conversation. Before we wrap up our interview, do you have any advices to the young composers who are just starting their artistic journey?
Well, I think first of all is to listen to as much music as possible, because it's our language. When we learn to talk, we must first learn to listen before we can talk. And so that's how you understand a language, is by talking and imitating. So I always say you must listen to as much as you can, and not just what's on the radio or what's on television, but seek out these musical masterpieces and become familiar with them. And that will help you to become a better composer. And then when you do compose, don't be afraid to show it to people. Don't be afraid to ask, what do you think of this? Because, many people won't give you opinions unless you ask them. And we always have to get better. We always have to improve upon the next piece that we write. That's how we keep going. If we wrote the perfect piece, we'd be done.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your work and your commitment to the music history. It was very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. And I'm looking forward to hearing your music in person already on November 30th. And I wish you a lot of success.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I have you to thank. You've done wonderful work, and I appreciate it so much. I really do.
Thank you so much. И напоследок вы услышите небольшой отрывок из литургии Курта Сантера в исполнении хора Российско-Американского музыкального института имени Патриарха Тихона, которое будет исполнено вживую 30 ноября в Соборной палате в Москве и затем 19 декабря в Белом зале Политехнического университета в Санкт-Петербурге. Все ссылки под видео. Также напоминаю, что концерты будут транслироваться на нашем YouTube-канале, так что подписывайтесь, и вы не пропустите наши онлайн-премьеры. Всем хорошего дня!